All right, in this video, we will close up the urinary system by talking about the accessory anatomy. And first, before we talk about accessory anatomy, we're going to talk about urine composition, just as we've talked quite a bit about urine, but we need to talk a little bit more about it. Urine is 95% water, and the other 5% is all the other things that are in urine. As you can see, the bulk of that other 5% is urea, which is a nitrogenous waste. It's from the breakdown of amino acids. And then there's also uric acid, which comes from nucleic acid metabolism. So when you break down something like the DNA that's in the food that you eat, this is what's created from that. Creatinine is a metabolite of creatine phosphate, and so you can see that there is also a major uh, solute in the urine. Lots of other things going on there. Anytime that, like, if you go to the doctor and you give them a urine sample, they are looking at some of these different solutes in order to find anything that would be high that shouldn't be there, or looking for things that shouldn't be in there at all, like proteins. There shouldn't be any proteins. They should have been all filtered out. Any like white blood cells, bile, pigments, anything like that can usually indicate some sort of pathology, and further tests would need to be done. And so the urine can actually tell you a lot about a person's health, and even from other parts of the body that have nothing to do with the urinary system. A little bit about the ureters. The ureters are just tubes that go from the kidneys to the bladder. And so their main purpose is to just transport the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. Very small tubes. You can see that here. And they enter the bladder through the posterior wall of the bladder. Basically, as the bladder increases in pressure, those ureters are going to close, and they prevent the backflow of urine, which would not be really good at all. One of the issues that can arise, and this kind of goes to the composition of urine as well, is something called renal caliculi, or kidney stones. And these are stones that occur in the renal pelvis. If you remember, the renal pelvis is that general area of the kidney. And these are basically just crystallized calcium and magnesium. And then the uric acid salts are also in there. These are just basically mineral stones. So they're really hard. They obstruct urine flow, and they go through those tiny little tubes, and it's not a pleasant experience. Thankfully, I've never had to deal with that. But apparently it's a horrible thing, from talking about from those who have had to deal with it. Obviously cause a tremendous amount of abdominal pain. Risk factors for kidney stones tend to be elevated blood calcium levels, elevated uric acid levels. If you eat a lot of things that are high in uric acid, that can cause a problem. Or if you are just dehydrated all the time and your kidneys are having to work a lot, then that can cause the buildup of these salts in the kidney. And then people who have them tend to have them again. So because they don't do things to prevent that. Prevention is just adequate hydration. Make sure that you have lots of water going through you. So a little bit about the bladder. The bladder is a muscular sac for the temporary storage of urine. The bladder is almost a holdover of an evolutionary past in which temporarily storing urine made sense, for things like marking territory and that sort of thing. But we no longer do that. And so it does make sense from a social standpoint to be able to temporarily store urine, obviously. The urinary bladder has one purpose, and that's kind of what it does. It can control the flow of that. Obviously, there are some skeletal muscles. We'll get into that in a second, but there's involuntary and voluntary structures with that. The bladder can hold around a pint of fluid, but it can actually hold more than that if it needs to. Um, and so, not a whole lot there. Pretty self-explanatory. And then the last one is the urethra, and this is the tube that drains the urinary bladder. This shows the urethra from both male and female anatomical perspective. Basically the same thing. So you have an internal urethral sphincter, and so this internal sphincter that controls the the flow of urine is an involuntary function, and so it just when it contracts, it opens. It's a little opposite of what you would think. And then you have an external urethral sphincter, which is a voluntary control. And this has to do with your pelvic floor muscles. And so, like the bottom portion of your pelvis here, you have several muscles that can control the flow of urine. And we're all familiar with that feeling of needing to use the restroom. And so you can control that flow. And so this is, like when a young kid is first learning how to do that, they're basically learning to control those muscles and not just kind of it not be it has to be a thinking process. And so kids eventually learn that. And that is a social function almost completely. Animals know how to hold their urine too, but they do so for different purposes. Theirs is more of a territorial thing, whereas ours tends to be more of a social, which I guess territorial is a social thing too. Just a little bit about some hormonal or not hormonal homeostatic imbalances here. Urinary tract infections are a common thing that people deal with. They're actually more common in women than they are in men. This typically just has to do with bacteria or other things that can get into the urethra and cause infections. Also, another problem is urinary incontinence, and this has to do with just weakened pelvic muscles. As you age, your pelvic muscles get weaker, and so you can have incontinence, which just means, peeing on yourself, basically. There are other things that can cause this, like coughing or sneezing or laughing, or just the simple fact that your bladder is full, and that would be called like overflow incontinence. Um, but in general, this is something that just is affected by age.